This is PTV World. I am SHABAHAT and you are watching Fault Lines. Ever since the new democratic government has taken guard in Pakistan, the economic situation of the country has turned out to be far more bleaker than expected. All of this has started with rise in international oil prices. The previous government, under the custodianship of Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, had decided to give a fuel subsidy on the fuel prices. That was a violation of contract that was done initially with International Monetary Fund. International Monetary Fund in return decided to renegotiate the terms with Pakistan and to ask Pakistan to implement the conditions that they had agreed during the previous rounds of talks. So the current government, in a spate of a week, had to jack up the fuel prices twice in a week, collectively a jump of 60 rupees in petrol price. This is the ever highest recorded price jack in the history of the country. This is giving birth to dual crisis. On one end, Pakistan is still facing a serious risk of default because the international debtors aren't giving us enough money to pull the country out of its immediate macroeconomic challenges. And on the other end, inflation and dearness of goods, the hike of prices is going to exacerbate the situation for the poor people in this country. How the overall macroeconomic situation is looking at the moment, we will have to see this in today's program. Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
Pakistan is navigating through a difficult economic situation as the trade deficit of the country has widened by an alarming 57.85% to an all-time high at $43.33 billion during the first 11 months of 2021-22. The trade deficit has been on the rise owing to an unprecedented increase in the imports due to the rise in the global commodity prices, while the exports stagnated around $2.5 billion to $2.8 billion a month, as per data from the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. The State Bank of Pakistan's total foreign reserves has dropped by $366 million to $9.72 billion due to the external debt repayments. Moody's Investors Service, one of the world's top 3 credit ratings agencies, has downgraded Pakistan's outlook from stable to negative. According to Moody's assessment, the decision to change the outlook to negative is driven by Pakistan's heightened external vulnerability risk and uncertainty around the sovereign ability to secure additional external financing to meet its needs. In another massive petrol price hike, the government has increased the petrol price to 209.86 per litre, and the development comes as Pakistan has yet to reach a staff-level agreement with the International Monetary Fund. The restoration of Pakistan's delayed IMF program rests on the government's capacity to make fiscal adjustments of about 2.5% of the gross domestic product by increasing revenues and reducing the expenditures in the upcoming budget of the year 2022-23.
Since the problem has started from the international oil markets, where oil has gone on the ever highest price of its known history, my first guest in the program is an expert of political economy, an expert of international oil prices. Frequently appears on my show, Mr. Samar Rizvi is joining me from Lahore. Osama, I welcome you to my program. Osama, where are the fuel prices today? When we spoke last time in our program, you had told us that there's a problem going on between the European Union and Russia. How far we have reached with this problem? How far has the problem gone so far?
Yes, European Union, EU, has been successful in churning out the 6th package of sanctions against Russia, which also includes banning all the Russian oil. That there is a caveat that travels through sea only, not the pipelines. So this includes around 60 to 65% of all the Russian oil that will be banned coming to the EU. And if Poland and Germany and Hungary, they agree, so there is a pipeline called Druzhba pipeline, which in Russian means friendship, which in English means friendship. So if that is also banned, then 90% of Russian crude oil will be banned from entering the European markets, which can create effects of unimaginable consequences for not only for the European countries, but also for the developing and emerging markets like us, We have seen what has happened in Pakistan, although the recent measures taken were not due to the recent effects, but something that happened a few months ago when we were late in our policy making decisions. But similar things can happen moving forward.
But Osama, where will this all end up to? I mean, if Russia is not able to settle its problems with the European Union, what exactly do you believe will happen in this oil prices scheme?
So, in case if prices, if European Union and Russia they don't get their issues resolved and they remain at daggers down with each other, I see, and if things exacerbate, I see, and I've written about it as well. I've spoken to other media outlets about it as well. It is documented that I see oil prices breaking their 2008 highs, which was 144 barrel just before the financial crisis. So I see easily prices touching $170, and in a worst case scenario, around $200. Why do I see that? Because first of all, Russian output has already started to fall. So there are different estimates, but according to the IEA, which is the Paris-based agency, International Energy Agency, the Russian oil output has fallen by more than 1 million barrels per day already. And as we move on in the coming months and after a year, it can go on all the way up to 3 million barrels per day. So 3 million barrels per day of global supply will be taken offline from the markets. This is happening when the world is opening up, when the COVID lockdowns in China, they're being eased off, or there is an expected increase in demand. So there is an increase in demand, but there is a looming supply crunch. Not only this, look at the distillates, the products that are made from the oil, and especially diesel. In the United States of America, there is an impending supply crunch of diesel and also of distillates. Global crude oil inventories have fallen at their fastest pace ever, and they have fallen by 600 million barrels in almost 1.5 years, which is incredible. So that said, if you compare this to the rising demand scenario and the sanctions on Russia and the uncertainty around global supply chains, this can trigger off effects that can lead oil prices all the way up to 170.
Somehow India has been able to do trade with Russia, the trade of oil, and it has dropped the fuel prices. Pakistan, unfortunately, has not been able to do the same. What do you believe are primary reasons behind this?
In terms of India, it's a very particular case. India has been on record buying Russian oil at a 20% discount, $35, $40 less than what the market is paying or we are paying. And India remains a part of the Quad agreement. India is a key US ally. I think I've said this in your program as well. So India enjoys a sovereign space. But on the other hand, Pakistan does not, or other countries do not. Why? I understand that diplomatic caveats may hinder our capability to get Russian oil, but that is the need of the hour. We do have diplomatic caveats that hinder our capability to buy oil from Russia, but we can bring in China. I've written about this. I've been trying to lobby or trying to try to highlight this fact that China is the largest buyer of Russian crude these days. China has increased its strategic petroleum reserves, so we should look for China. Try some agreement. When there is a way, when there is will, there is a way. So we should look for China to give us that oil at a steep discount. Otherwise, what is happening right now, balance payment prices, import bill, falling reserves. Prices, you might be paying around 300 rupees at petrol in a matter of few months. So that is quite something that needs proactive and preemptive attention from the government and the policymakers.
Thank you very much, Osama, for being a guest in our program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Osama Rizvi, and he has a very unique point of view about all of the situation. He's connecting Pakistan's current economic situation with the international market. To join me in this part of program now is Dr. Adil Malik. Dr. Adil Malik is a professor at University of Oxford and is an expert of political economy. Dr. Adil Malik, I welcome you to my program.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
Doctor, first things first, so we are talking about the soaring debt situation of Pakistan. Instead of discussing the numbers here, I would want to understand, how do you see this international debt problem as the debts are piling up for many countries, Pakistan being one of them.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. Pakistan is not alone in terms of facing the debt problem, in the sense that during COVID, we had a major slowdown of the economy, and indebtedness, levels of indebtedness have actually increased both in developed and developing countries. So this is a global challenge. Pakistan is not the only country facing that challenge. Where there is a specific Pakistan problem is the one that is more structural, which has to do with lack of economic reform over the last 30, 40-year period, where we are spending more money than we are earning. And so um, persistently we've been incurring budget deficits. And one of the prime reasons for this budget deficit is that our tax to GDP ratio is very low and is highly regressive, high levels of taxes on a small number of people. Um, and then we have loss-making public sector organizations which consume over ₹1 trillion worth of money, um, and we are printing. So how do we really fill this gap? We actually print notes. Now it's becoming more difficult to do that, so you have to borrow from private market. So obviously that increases debt. You have to borrow from international market, either by issuing bonds or getting support from the International Monetary Fund. So I think the structural issue that we face is that our fiscal house is not in order. And that certainly creates conditions where we are becoming more and more indebted. In recent years, debt has increased a lot. There are a number of factors why debt has increased over the last, 3, 4 years. Um, One of them is that obviously our exchange rate is depreciating, so the cost of debt is increasing, right? So the overall absolute value of debt is increasing. Also, our discount rate is increasing. So the interest rate increase means that when the government borrows money from the private banking system, the cost of that debt is actually higher. Um, a number of these factors are actually joining together to create an explosive situation.
Doctor, before I ask you my next question, if you can just take your mic slightly far from your mouth, because it's just giving an additional sound. Now, my next question is that you have pointed out two things simultaneously. One is a vicious cycle that is actually becoming a problem for all these countries that are under the immense burden of debt. And the second problem that you just identified is that there are not only the few countries but many countries which are falling further steeper into the debt crisis. Now tell me if this is also a point of concern for the international lenders, because if more countries like Sri Lanka are falling below the line where they don't have capacity to pay back, will it not just trigger another global economic crisis?
Well, I mean, international lenders are obviously worried, but remember, for a lot of international lenders, it's important to have customers, and countries that need more debt are customers effectively. And so quite a lot of the debt is actually given out to repay old debt. And that is usually the case with the IMF money. It usually comes in to pay off older debts. Um, this is a very complicated, is a very um, sort of complex issue in terms of debt, because there is the economics of it, which is to do with lenders being able to recover money, but there is also the politics or geopolitics of it, where you know the more indebted certain countries are, the more the international system can use the economic leverage and a geopolitical leverage on that country. And this goes far back in time. And in fact, in a previous program, we talked about the role of sanctions. When it comes to debt, I think an important point that as an economist I need to make, and your viewers need to listen to, is that debt per se is not bad. What you do with that debt is the real thing. If you are just borrowing money to pay off salaries or for consumption purposes, this is clearly a problem. It's a problem for an individual who's overstepping his means and is constantly borrowing money just to consume, um, versus a situation where an individual actually borrows money to invest in something so that he or she can increase the income. And so same is true for countries. I mean, when countries borrow money to invest in their physical infrastructure for productive investments, it expands the productive potential and increases growth in the economy. The problem is when your growth is lower than the rate at which you are borrowing money and your debt servicing obligations, then your ability to pay back that debt is severely compromised. So I think growth is an important part of this story when we think about indebtedness and the different economic challenges it poses.
But Dr. Shab, in our case, IMF is asking us to slow down the pace of our economy. They said you have been growing far too phenomenally, so you need to cool down your economy. You have to rise the rate of bank loans. You have to make sure that the process of business stops. So do you believe this is a right course of action for an economy like Pakistan? Because with the economy slowing down, there will be more people jobless, and with this rising tide of inflation, this will just crush so many people, which might just create further problems for us.
That's true, but remember the fund has a very narrow mandate. It's really going to think about balance of payment support. You know, when your current account deficit is out of order, you're importing more than what you're exporting. You're consuming more than you're producing, and you don't have the resources to pay for your imports. Then the IMF will do things that will compress the demand of the economy, and that's a short-run adjustment path for an economy, where they will ask you to do certain prior actions, right, which we are already taking in terms of increase in fuel prices, and whole range of taxes and so on and so forth, reducing government spending. All of this is to sort of compress the demand in the economy and to bring back equilibrium in terms of current account deficit. But that means that growth shrinks in that process, right? But there are a lot of things that the IMF is not stopping you from doing, which you should do. For example, in Pakistan, less than 1 million people or thereabout pay direct income taxes. So there's a big distributive question that a lot of people who are rich, who have multiple properties, who earn lots of money, are disproportionately paying fewer taxes compared to the poor people who have to pay taxes through fuel. They have to pay generalized sales taxes. They have a whole raft of taxes. So effectively, the economy is organized, especially the taxation structure, in a highly regressive fashion, whereby effectively we are, the poor are subsidizing the rich. And you would find that, I mean, in Britain, for example, I live in a mortgage property. If I were to buy another property and rent it out, the tax rate would be higher. When I become a professor, I move into 40% tax rate, right? And then that's distributed through social services. The rich are very poorly taxed in Pakistan. Now, that is not to say that there are not enough taxes. There are lots of taxes in Pakistan, but they are mostly indirect taxes, the burden of which is largely or disproportionately borne by poor people. There are other such reforms that we need to undertake, right, in terms of loss-making enterprises, in terms of improving our trade policy stance, improving the export structure, addressing the cartelization of the economy. The IMF never stops us from doing those, implementing those structural reforms, which we should be taking ourselves. The problem is every 5 years, we face a current account deficit. We knock the doors of the IMF. IMF has a very standard recipe for addressing these balance of payments problems. They pass it down our nose and our throats. We implement them. But do we have our own approach? Do we have our own intellectual thinking on how we are going to get out of this economic mess? That's the question we need to focus on.
Dr. Malik, very interesting take from your side. Now, while responding to my first question, you mentioned the vicious circle of poverty that Pakistan is stuck in at the moment. It all starts from the jump in oil prices. I mean, the recent one. We understand that Pakistan is in a vicious circle, stuck for last several decades. But the recent one started from the oil prices going high. That makes imports more expensive. That widens the trade deficit that we have. With the widening trade deficit, we need to knock at the doors of international lenders, and the lender organizations that give us recipes that do not that are not popular and that do not solve many of the issues for the government. The governments become democratically elected governments become more unpopular, and this vicious circle is taking too long to be broken. Do we have any way out to steer out of this vicious circle? Are there any example of the countries that have broken this deadly vicious circle of poverty?
Yeah, so there are a number of questions, but I'll address the one that's most clear from your argumentation, which is about the sort of oil prices and how we deal with it. And there's a connected question about this poverty cycle, or this cycle where we end up on the IMF norms every 5 years. I think the question about fuel is something that is again has many layers to it. So the first thing is that we are buying oil at a very high price. We have to buy at a high oil price. Those prices are high not just for Pakistan but for the whole world. Even in UK, I'm feeling the pinch of very high fuel prices. And these fuel prices, in many ways, need to be passed on to the consumers, because if you don't pass on to the consumers, you are subsidizing everyone. The worst way of subsidizing, an economy or the consumer is by giving them blanket fuel subsidies. Because if you have a V8 car or you have a 1300cc car, you're going to use more fuel. You are being subsidized more than the poor man on the street. So we need to pass on the prices. But I think where this problem becomes exacerbated is firstly that because our currency is devaluing, the rupee value of this oil actually is also increasing, which has not increased in the case of Bangladesh because its currency hasn't devalued. Oil prices have increased, but not it's because we buy sort of oil in dollars, and when the dollar is appreciating, we need to pay more rupees to buy the same amount of oil. So there's an attendant. There are two issues. One is increase in global oil prices, and the second is also pressure on our currency, which makes oil buying oil more expensive for us. So I'll come to that in a minute. But for the first one, global oil prices, I think we have to pass on the oil prices, but then we have to protect the consumers. And protecting it requires many strategies. One is we can do fuel cards like Egypt is doing, or other places where somebody who has a motorcycle, somebody who has a very small car, transportation, we need to subsidize those for the poorest segments, right? But that could be a more targeted subsidy that is targeted at the weakest segments who are going to bear the brunt of it. For many of my friends who have Mercedes-Benz or BMW or very good cars in Islamabad, Lahore, and Karachi, they're not going to feel the pinch. But it's really the very poor, and you can compensate them by giving them subsidies. The other thing you can do is build transport infrastructure. It's also good for climate. I think we need good transport infrastructure in our cities that will allow people to move from one place to another without incurring too much cost. Thirdly, we need good supply chain. A lot of our goods move within the country on land, right? So in terms of motorways or highways, you're bringing food, vegetables, other consumer goods. And so the cost of transportation increases. Again, there are ways in which countries have addressed that by developing a more efficient rail system, for example, where you can move goods more easily compared to cars. So, but that's the sort of medium-term transition, and I think we need to go towards that transition. There is another solution for countries, which is that we are right next to Iran. Iran is one of the major sort of oil-producing countries. The cost of transporting oil is very low. We can barter trade with them, but the challenge that Pakistan faces there is that geopolitically it is very difficult. If we are going to buy oil from Iran, America is not going to be happy. A lot of our Gulf partners will not be happy. But I think we need to speak with our friends in the West and in the Gulf countries that, look, stability of Pakistan is paramount. And if our economy becomes unstable, that is not going to benefit our Western partners either. So you need to give us some strategic concessions. And one of them is to be able to buy cheaper oil from some of the neighboring states. But that requires a vision on the part of the leadership, confidence, and ability to negotiate the interests for these countries. As far as the first issue is concerned, which is about current account deficit, I think the issue for Pakistan is that we are a growing country. The middle class is expanding. There's a lot of consumer imports, but our exports are simply not keeping pace. Our economy's fundamental structure is tilted against exports. Bangladesh has more than $40 billion of exports, right? And together with remittances, they have room to wiggle. Whereas in our case, we are facing a current account deficit every few years. And to address it, you need a coherent trade policy. And to have a coherent trade policy, you need to change the fundamental incentive structure for production. What do I mean by that? I mean by that the state needs to have an industrial policy, it needs to support the export sector, and it needs to remove distortions against export sector. There are two major distortions, in my opinion. First major distortion has to do with excessive preference for real estate. Look, all of us, the middle classes, the upper classes, they're all investing in real estate. It's very easy to invest money in real estate and to earn from it, but it does not produce much, right? Which means that if I'm an industrialist and I want to set up an export factory, why would I spend money in a factory, bear all the uncertainty, pay the wages for laborers, and then worry about international markets when I can actually invest in a housing society and earn millions and billions of rupees without doing a lot. I mean, just using your connections, and maybe, there's obviously hard work required there. So we need to tax the real estate sector. The problem there is that a lot of our elites are heavily invested in the real estate sector. So they create packages, tax exemptions. So the entire structure of the economy is fundamentally tilted away from exports. The second way in which exports are being compromised is through our trade policy, our tariff barriers, non-tariff measures, regulatory duties. Our trade policy is one of the most convoluted in the world, right? It's one of the most highly protectionist regimes in the world, which means that we use discretion to define where, what regulatory duties to be imposed, where, how much tariff to be given. Some of them are politically influential industries, and we protect them, and with the result that the export sector suffers. So I think the most important thing.
Dr. Adil,
Yes.
I think you have summed it up pretty nicely and have hit the nail on its head. We have a very clear idea from your conversation that not only this entire economic system is based on designs that are further drifting it away from where exactly it should be, but also the problem is going to increase over a period of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Malik, for being a guest in our program today. This was Dr. Adil Malik from Oxford University. He made some very important and very pertinent points. One of his points is that when the majority of the capital is overwhelmingly occupied in the real estate sector, that does not employ a lot of people, that does not bring a lot of tax. It is not possible for the country to focus on its exports. Ladies and gentlemen, from this point onward, we have to focus this conversation on the macroeconomics of the country. And for this, I have invited one of my favorite guests in the program, Dr. Waqar Ahmed. He is now Senior Joint Executive Director of SDPI. And I welcome Dr. Waqar you to my program.
Thank you, sir. Thank you indeed.
We actually wanted to have you in the studio, but since you're in Peshawar, this conversation will go on the telephone. Doctor, what is the macroeconomic outlook of the country at the moment, and how concerned you are with this current outlook? Is the risk of default still hovering on our heads?
Yes, thank you very much. I think like any other citizen, like any other Pakistani, I remained very concerned during the past 2 weeks, given that rupee was shedding its value very fast. Trade gap was widening very fast. We also had pressures on the government budget, and we could really see fiscal deficit expanding. But I think this week, and particularly the past 2 to 3 days, have really given some news which is leading to soothing of markets. We have seen the announcement from China which is going to bolster our foreign exchange reserves to the tune of $2.5 billion. We are also noticing that a staff-level agreement with IMF is around the corner now, and most probably it will be finalized immediately after the budget speech. Contingent upon that, Saudis have also offered that once, of course, the IMF staff-level agreement is reached, Saudis would also be willing to mobilize $3 billion of reserves. So all in all, I think the later part of this week has brought in good news, and I believe that this good news is going to act in three possible directions. One is that it is going to stabilize the rupee, and it is quite possible that rupee will actually gain some of its value going forward last week or so. Second, of course, it is going to provide stability to our foreign exchange reserves. Even this week as well, we had to make some repayments, and we could see that foreign exchange reserves value did come down. Third, I believe that it is going to also give some stability to our balance of payments, which is extremely essential in terms of stabilizing Pakistan's derivatives and bonds, which are out there in the capital market, which have been under increasing pressure. So I think if we are able to consolidate these gains going forward and immediately after the budget as well, we are hopeful that things would soon be in our favor, and we could really embark on the path of macroeconomic stability during the next quarter.
Dr. Waqar, thank you very much for bringing this out, and I appreciate your optimism as well. But for a person like me, this is pretty much like firefighting. We are just trying to take this ship away from the risk of sinking. But the elephant remains in the room, and that is our wide budget deficit and our trade deficit, importantly. I was reading in the newspaper today the trade deficit is now $44 billion US. And if we do not take appropriate measures now, this demand for external money will never end. We will have to keep, going on the same path, as the same road. So do you believe this is the right time for the government to now focus on its, to now turn the focus of its policy toward trade management or trade regulations?
I think that's a very important observation, and I think the government is cognizant of this fact, and they have in fact applied hard brakes on the imports, despite the fact that they were advised that WTO may react or our peer countries who trade with us may react, but government has actually moved forward for applying hard brakes on imports, including, of course, raising of duties or outright banning of some commercial quantities of imports. And you're going to immediately see a tapering or diminishing of or narrowing down of the trade gap in this and the next month as well. I think on the fiscal deficit, again, your point is important. And I think there are two main elephants. There are two main elephants in the room. One, of course, is the huge subsidies budget, of course, which we have had to run post-pandemic. Of course, we've had to continue subsidizing commodities, subsidizing fuel prices, for example, subsidizing electricity. And it has now come to a point where we cannot sustain further subsidies because government's earning is limited. And the amount of borrowing that government can do is also limited. So I think in the coming months, you will see tapering and reduction in those subsidies, which I'm hoping will bring down the fiscal deficit during the first and second quarter of the next fiscal year. But this year, of course, we're going to end up on a high fiscal deficit comes the 30th of June.
Dr. You just pointed out subsidies, which is one of my favorite subjects again. And, from the outlook, it apparently looks that the previous government, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, was very benevolently giving out subsidies on many things. There was subsidy on health, there was subsidy on so many things, on meals, on residences. Now, what is the burden of subsidy on our budget at the moment? I mean, how much of our national exchequer is actually going toward the subsidies?
Yes. So currently, almost 8 to 10% of your government expenditure is entirely devoted to various types of subsidies. This is to the tune of a little above 600 billion rupees, which are actually going in subsidies. While these are direct subsidies, but let me also say that there are some indirect subsidies as well, or some cross subsidies as well, which are harder to recognize in the government budget. But I think one sort of needs to recognize that yes, there was benevolence demonstrated by the last government. They of course had faced COVID, and they were coming out of COVID, and they were taking their time to bring the subsidies down. Little did we realize that oil prices after Russia and Ukraine war would really go out of hands, and we won't be able to afford oil the way we were during the pandemic times when markets were shut and production was shut. And I think it's due to the rising cost of imported oil that subsidies budget quickly, on the back of course, supporting oil prices, quickly expanded and went out of our control. And it is now, of course, that we have realized, and IMF has also made us realize that we won't be able to sustain these high subsidies or support the subsidized oil prices.
Dr. Waqar, Dr. Adil Malik in this same program said that Pakistan's expansion of the tax net has not been very promising. You working in Pakistan, I'm sure have a better idea of the efforts being done by FPR, which have been applauded, not only by the previous government, but also by the current government. They were very appreciative of the efforts of FPR. Please tell us if Pakistan has done a commendable job in the expansion of the tax net, or do you believe there are still margin of improvement in their efforts?
Yes, I think in the tax space, we have tried to put up a very decent fiscal effort. And it's not just the federal government, it's also the provincial governments who have done well. And given that after the 18th Amendment, all provinces have opened up their own revenue authorities as well, you are seeing greater revenues coming up. The other thing that actually helped FBR was the rising value of trade. And I think with imports closing in this year at around $78 billion, almost 50% of FPR's revenue actually came from the rising value of trade this year. But of course, FPR has also taken some administrative improvements, including Pakistan's single window. And PSW is now streamlining the customs procedures, that many of those things which were, for example, facing the problem that we are facing of under-invoicing or flying invoices, many of those things would now be combated, and we are actually getting the real customs value coming in the tax net.
And Dr. Waqar, when we talk about the import regulation, as you have pointed out for the second time in this conversation, you also said that there are problems with regard to World Trade Organization as well. They do not appreciate us banning the imports. Yet in the past, we have very successfully discouraged the import of vehicles. That was at some time one of the largest expanding portion of our net imports. So how do you believe the government can smartly come out of it? Are there ways to actually come smartly out of it? Can we, as a member of the international community, put sanctions or bans or double or triple the duties on various items of import and still keep exporting to all the Western world?
Yes, I think Ministry of Commerce has really put up a very strong case. And the case included 2 or 3 arguments. First, of course, was that there has been an unanticipated increase in price of imported oil, food, and metals, something which wasn't anticipated before Russia and Ukraine war. And this has really thrown the equation in our balance of payments beyond, of course, our means. Second, of course, the government has also argued that we have seen the case of Sri Lanka in front of us, and this is something that we really don't want to go that way, and preemptive action has to be taken. Thirdly, government has reminded the WTO of its own bylaws, wherein a government anticipating a balance of payments crisis can actually put up the kind of measures which Pakistan has put up against commercial quantities of imports. So for now, while of course there has been a defending note from WTO and IMF, but for now they haven't imposed any kind of penalties on Pakistan.
And how about our exports? I mean, are you happy of the way our exports have been expanding? Because again, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf's government has been quite consistently reminding us that the exports have gone higher during their stay in the government. Are you happy with the export outlook of the country? Because the export industry is also taking a lot of these subsidies, which you just pointed out previously.
I think 2 points are important over here. The weakening of rupee has certainly helped the exporting sector. The exporting sector has become more competitive abroad, and of course, this year we have seen not only a good, decent growth in our textile and garment exports, but many other export-oriented sectors have also benefited. We have also been able to, of course, the weakening of rupee also allowed us to penetrate into new markets. So you may have heard yesterday's news that rice is now seeing a record export sale in China, for example, making use of China-Pakistan FTA. But I think your point is very important, because we don't have sectors other than the non-traditional sectors which could benefit from this kind of an opportunity. So our export basket is really confined to 2 or 3 items which can take benefit of this weak currency at the moment, or central banks liberal credit which was given to the exporting industry. And I think over time we really need to have greater goods and services in our export basket. We are hoping that ICT and IT sector holds a lot of promise. They have shown promising export numbers during the COVID times. One hopes that this momentum will maintain during our coming months as well.
Dr. Saab rightly said, but still the IT sector doesn't enjoy to be a major part of our net exports. We're still exporting towels, denims, and many other items of hosiery and clothing. And this industry is taking the brunt of the energy crisis as well. And also the fact that with the oil prices and electricity prices going higher, the cost of production is going to phenomenally increase for all of these. So do you recommend, or would you recommend to the government giving some specific subsidies, or would IMF allow us to give subsidies to the sector where we are going to win our bread from?
Yes, I think for now, of course, the industry may have to take a bit of hit, and it's not just the Pakistan industry, it is industry all over the globe that is going to take a hit because of the rising prices of gas and electricity. And of course, it is only going to be in the coming months when, of course, the supply of oil and gas stabilizes, increases in the coming months, that global industrial production will see falling oil prices. Of course, that also depends on the war situation and what happens between Europe and Russia and their dealings in the energy market. This is a big question mark, but it's not just Pakistan's industry which faces this kind of uncertainty. Pakistan's competitors are also facing this kind of uncertainty. Now, of course, this is where diplomatic efforts are required to secure supplies on deferred payments so that our industry remains insulated, or at least even if it gets energy on higher prices, it is able to budget those higher prices in their balance sheets well in time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waqar, for being guest in our program. And I highly appreciate your optimism. You refuse to leave your optimism in any case. I am highly appreciative of this.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Dr. Waqar Ahmed from STPI, a very optimistic economist, and he believes that not only the government requires to do a lot for pulling Pakistan out of the current economic crisis, but also he believes that the government is currently on the right track and quite cognizant of the fact that what exactly needs to be done to steer the country out of this crisis. One more important thing that we could not discuss in today's program is the political stability of Pakistan. Any democracy requires political stability to thrive and to take such drastic economic measures. We'll join you tomorrow again with yet another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.